I like that you introduce sort of this representational, I guess I don't know if you call it representational vocabulary or representational thinking or whatever,
Yeah.
but to be able to establish, like three or so patterns and say, associate this melody with what this is visually, and then be able to mix that around, it makes it that much easier to improvise because in your mind, you're just shifting it. So for me, that made total sense. And I don't know that I've really done much, and I'm going on 30 years of drumming in regards to something that was kind of simplified that way visually, and that could then also conversely be done improvisationally and have it work out like that. I was actually surprised that, again, to your point, I think the payoff was quicker and sooner than I imagined in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's like the concept of chunking, if you've heard of it. And a lot of people speak about it in a way that I think oversimplifies its potential. But like the idea with chunking is like, that's why we learn rudiments, right? So your first day of drums, when you learn a paradiddle, you have to think about each individual note. If you go, okay, right, and then left, and then what's next? Oh, right, and then right.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you've done that for, 1,000 times,
Yeah.
you just merely think the thought paradiddle, and your hands do the thing, right? It is one individual piece of information now, but in that chunk of information is an entire sticking and is, in some cases, an entire rhythmic melody or like whatever it might be, coordination. There's all this stuff built into the chunk. And as people gain mastery at anything, the chunks contain, you can't remember like more chunks, but the chunks contain more information, right? And they have more to draw from in your memory, right? You've loaded all of this stuff in your procedural memory, and you can pull out larger chunks of it. You can start thinking of rearranging those chunks, or you can start thinking of merely melodies that you're familiar with, and the chunks will fill themselves in.
Yeah.
And for a course like that, and for much of my teaching, I'm trying to always reverse engineer what it feels like to improvise. Right? So I'm thinking like, well, what's going on in my mind? Right? I'm thinking of melodies. Well, how do we get melodies? Well, we need to upload them in chunks, and the most useful melodic chunks. That's what we need. And there's like an interesting end point, like when you speak, for example, like you're referring to chunks of like linguistic information, but you're also not really thinking about rearranging chunks.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, like when you learn to improvise, first you upload the chunks, and then you use the chunks, like when you export them onto the drum set. So you begin thinking in chunks and rearranging them, and that gives you coordination, that gives you new emergent melodies. But there's a certain point where you're not actually even thinking in chunks on the way out. You're thinking just melodies and shape and structure in a larger degree and phrasing, and the chunks of information are just there, like faithfully executing your vision. You know what I mean?
Right. Totally. Yeah. Ideally, I think at that point you are in what is ultimately, I guess, the flow mode. Which is what you're trying to get to.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you noticed, and especially for the listeners, if y'all heard me laughing during one of those explanations. In addition, for JP setting the record for the longest podcast episode, definitely no one has said the word chunk more frequently over the course of a conversation. And you said it so. I just started laughing. I was trying to contain my laughter. For some reason, I was just like a 5-year-old laughing at the word chunk being mentioned over and over again. It's just fucking hilarious to me.
Yeah, I know, right? Especially, I need to work on my terminology. Inward chunks and outward chunks. I don't know.
I think at some point you said chunk melody, and I thought that's the one that really got me.
Yeah, you can name the episode that.
Chunk melody. Oh, damn it. That's so good. Oh, God.
Do you improvise much on your own? Do you sit at the kit and just fuck around?
I do, and I have, and I've been hitting a wall about it, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot as of late because, again, after 30 years, I'm just wondering why I can't just sit down and sort of not feel as though I'm confined to something. I think part of it is that I'm still kind of in a cerebral rudiment kind of mind. I'm the chunks that I'm going through. I may be thinking a little bit of melody, but I think ultimately I'm still tied to rudiments. And I think that has been one of the bigger challenges, and it's something that I've in speaking to a lot of drummers, it's part of in getting to the flow mode in which you referenced. That's something that is one of the hurdles to get to that point. You kind of have to get out of a cerebral rudiment-based place, to my understanding, and get to where that work has been done. As you said, you're hearing and seeing whatever it is, shapes, colors, phrases, and you can just play and get in it and be there and do it. But getting to that place for me has been the challenge.
Yeah. Not that you asked, but that's a part of the process that I find particularly interesting. And that is, as I'm sure you've picked up on, like that is, well, something I try to reiterate often in the rhythmic vocabulary stuff is that each rudiment because the problem you just described, I think, is very common. Right? We put a ton of focus on rudiments. We've got all these patterns that we can execute very quickly on a pad. And then we sit at the drum set, and none of it seems to really apply anymore. Or we can move between rudiments, but it sounds like we're moving between rudiments.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like the rudiments are identifiable still on the drum set, which you don't really want.
Right.
You don't listen to, your favorite drummer play and think like, oh, wow, those are some nice paradiddle diddles that you just played. Right? It's just you hear music, and it happens to be made of rudiments and other things. So my whole rhythmic vocabulary thing is that people are spending too much time thinking about only the stickings of rudiments and zero time extracting the melodies that are built into every rudiment. Right. So like classic example is the paradiddle, right? The paradiddle itself, right, left, right, left, right, left, left. That, a lot of people struggle to apply that on the drum set. But if you think about what the right hand melody is, right? Ba, 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 right, left, right, left, right, left. That is extremely useful and you use all the time. And the thing is, once you extract the melody, it no longer has to be confined to the sticking, right? So the sticking is one way to create the melody. You can put your right hand on the tom, put your left hand on ghost notes, and you go boom, 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 and that's great. But you now, and I'm not really telling this to you. I mean, you might. I'm telling this to. I'm drawing out the theory is that if where you extract that melody, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to apply it to the kick drum. Boom, 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 boom. Or you can put it on the right hand while on the bell while you're kick and snare play like four on the floor, right? So you're going ding, 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 boom. And so the melody becomes a part of you. The sticking is built into the chunk associated with that melody. And then you also have to develop, that chunk of information also has to develop like the independence and coordination, for example, to put it on the kick drum underneath the groove. Right. Or something like that, right? So like, every rudiment has melodies built in. Now, I think some of them are more useful than others. That's why I have the thing called the Big 10 or the Big 8 for triplets. But that's exactly, I mean, you like couldn't have teed that up better. Yeah. Because, if some parent came to me and they're like, my 2-year-old, they are going to play drums and they will do whatever you say for the next 2 decades. Yeah. Right? I would, and it was like their whole, I knew they would do all the work I wanted, and they were just going to like be my little curriculum prototype child. I would, from the beginning, as soon as they started playing rudiments, I would be emphasizing the melodic content of every rudiment that they played while they went, and they have to be able to sing it, and they have to be able to play it, bring out the right hand melody, left hand melody. Because once all that melodic content is in your head, then you can imagine if you can rearrange the melodic content in your head, you can like improvise, just going ba da 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 ba da da. You can do that and it be interesting. Then translating it to the drum set is a fairly easy next step, right? The problem a lot more people have is that they've got all this coordination and technique and rudiments, and they can play fast. But there's no interesting melodic content in their library. Yeah. So you could play, the fastest rudiments around the drum set ever, but it's not going to make it unique or interesting. It's just going to be fast and boring. Right. So, interesting drumming really comes from many things. But one of them that I'm convinced is the most commonly missing is that ability to create simply unique melodies at the core before you even think about how you're going to creatively beam them down to the drum set.